Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. You know we love your research requests, and this one is a real gem.
Yeah.
You sent us a whole stack of stuff on vintage capital, which makes me think of like a wine cellar.
Right.
But it's actually about how the age of technology impacts economic growth.
It's super interesting.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart of how innovation drives progress.
Totally.
And as you found in your research,
Yeah.
it has some really big implications for policy decisions.
So let's jump in. What exactly is vintage capital?
Okay.
So picturing like dusty old machines in a factory somewhere.
Well, not necessarily dusty. Vintage capital refers to the age of the technology embedded in something.
Sure.
Like a machine, a car, or even a whole factory.
Got it.
And here's the key.
Okay.
It's different from its physical age.
Oh,
So like a 10-year-old car could have cutting-edge tech from just a year ago,
okay.
but a brand new factory might be using machinery based on decades-old technology.
So it's about when the tech was cutting edge, not when the thing itself was built.
Exactly.
Okay.
Like you could buy a brand new flip phone today,
Right.
but the technology is like straight out of the early 2000s.
Totally. Like Windows.
Right. Like Windows.
You could buy a new copy of Windows XP in 2010,
Exactly.
even though Windows 7
Yep.
with newer technology was already out.
Uh-huh.
So newer vintages are generally more productive,
Right.
which makes sense.
Uh-huh.
But how much does this really matter for the economy as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Can tweaking the age of technology really move the needle on something as big as like economic growth?
That's where the debate gets interesting.
Okay.
For decades, economists have been arguing about just how significant vintage capital is.
Mm.
There's this thing called the Embodiment Controversy.
Dude, I love a good controversy.
Okay, well,
So what are the two sides?
back in the 1960s, economist Dennison argued that policy can't realistically shift the age structure of capital enough to make a real difference.
Mm.
He assumed all investment goes into the newest vintage. So in his view, promoting new tech wouldn't change overall productivity that much.
That's a pretty bold assumption.
It is.
Is there like another side to this story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
More recent research, particularly by Jovanovich and Yatsenko, whose work you sent us, challenges Dennison's view.
Okay.
They argue that investment can go into any vintage, not just the newest one.
Okay.
Think about it. You could buy a brand new car with like relatively old technology,
Right.
or invest in a cutting-edge 3D printer for your business.
Yeah.
Those are vintage choices
Mm.
with real economic consequences.
So it's not a simple new versus old equation.
No.
It's about understanding how investment flows into different vintages and how that impacts the overall economy.
Right.
It's like this giant economic engine
Yeah,
with
yeah.
the gears of all different technological ages, and we're trying to figure out how they mesh together.
Exactly. And the JY12 model,
Yeah.
as it's called, gives us a framework for understanding how this complex system works.
Okay.
It highlights a few key concepts. First, different vintages are not always perfect substitutes.
Okay.
So a firm might have the latest computers,
Yeah.
but still use older furniture and work in an older building.
Mhm.
These different vintages coexist
Yeah.
because they serve different purposes and can't be easily swapped out.
Like having the latest smartphone but driving a trusty old car.
Exactly.
They both have their place.
Right.
Okay, cool.
Another key concept is the learning curve.
Hmm.
So newer vintages might be inherently more productive,
Right.
but it takes time for people to learn how to use them efficiently.
Totally.
This means older tech can still be competitive for a while,
Yeah.
especially people already comfortable and experienced with it.
I still remember when I got my first smartphone.
Yeah,
It took me forever to figure out how to use it.
right. Exactly.
Okay.
The research you sent uses the example of industrial robots.
Okay.
So even though robots are becoming more popular, businesses are still investing in non-automated machinery
Mm.
because part of that is due to the learning curve associated with using robots effectively.
So it's like a balancing act between embracing new technology and making the most of what you already have.
Exactly.
So I'm really intrigued by these vintage-specific policies you mentioned.
Yep.
What exactly are they?
So vintage-specific policies are basically government actions that favor certain vintages of capital,
Okay.
either intentionally or unintentionally.
Okay.
And some of the examples in your research might surprise you.
Let's hear them.
Okay, so for starters, China heavily supports new tech industries.
Uh-huh.
They have a whole list of subsidized equipment,
Okay.
including things like cutting-edge renewable energy tech and advanced manufacturing tools.
So they're really putting their money where their mouth is.
They are.
What are some other examples?
Singapore offers tax breaks for companies investing in specific technologies,
Okay.
like data analytics and robotics.
Got it.
And many European countries have policies promoting electric vehicles, which sort of implicitly disadvantages older gas-powered cars.
Interesting. So it seems like a lot of these policies are aimed at pushing the economy towards like newer, more sustainable technologies.
Yeah.
Is there ever a case for supporting older tech?
There is. Okay, and it often comes down to job protection. So we see this happening in Europe where governments sometimes support industries that are facing obsolescence.
Right.
Think about coal mining or traditional manufacturing.
Yeah.
Areas where jobs are at risk because of newer, more efficient technologies.
So it's like a tough balancing act,
It is.
trying to foster innovation while also protecting existing jobs and livelihoods.
Exactly.
But the key takeaway here
Yeah.
is that these vintage-specific policies, whether deliberate or not, are shaping the economic landscape in really profound ways.
They are.
They're influencing how businesses invest, what technologies are adopted, and ultimately how the economy grows.
Exactly.
So here's the million-dollar question.
Okay.
If governments throw money at shiny new tech, does that automatically boost the economy?
That's what we might think.
Seems like a no-brainer, right?
It does.
Support the latest and greatest and watch the economy soar.
Right. But your research reveals a much more complex picture. In fact, subsidizing the newest vintage can actually hurt the economy in the long run.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah,
That doesn't seem right.
I know.
Subsidizing new tech, the stuff that's supposed to make us more productive and efficient, could actually make things worse?
It's not as simple as that.
Explain this to me like I'm 5.
Okay, imagine a kid gets the newest video game console for their birthday.
Okay.
Even though it's the most advanced console on the market,
Yeah.
it takes time for the kid to learn how to use it
Right.
and master all the games.
Yeah.
The same thing happens in the economy,
Okay.
even with subsidies.
Yeah.
It takes time for new tech to be integrated and used effectively.
I got it.
And the research suggests that this delay, combined with other factors,
Okay.
can offset the initial benefits of the subsidy.
So it's not just about having the technology. It's about being able to use it effectively.
Exactly.
It's like buying a top-of-the-line oven when you can barely boil water.
Yeah.
You're not going to be whipping up gourmet meals anytime soon.
So you need the skills to match.
Okay.
The JY12 model actually found that a 20% subsidy on the newest tech led to a 1% decline in overall consumption. And get this, the effect gets worse as the subsidy increases.
Really?
Yeah.
How bad does it get?
Well, a 100% subsidy,
Wow.
where the newest tech is basically free.
So it's just given away?
Yeah, could cause consumption to drop by a staggering 18%.
Wow. Those are pretty scary numbers.
They are.
But I'm still struggling to wrap my head around why subsidizing new tech could backfire so badly.
Yeah.
What's the logic there?
Okay, well, it comes down to a few key factors.
Okay.
We've already talked about the learning curve.
Yeah.
But there's more to it.
Okay.
Subsidies can actually distort investment decisions, leading businesses to overinvest in new tech before it's truly viable.
Like rushing to buy those fancy 3D printers even though your staff isn't trained to use them?
Exactly.
Okay.
Plus, remember how we talked about different vintages not being perfect substitutes?
Yeah.
That's another piece of the puzzle. So if a small price difference due to a subsidy causes a huge shift in investment toward newer vintages,
Okay.
older but still productive capital might be prematurely scrapped.
Oh.
And this can actually create inefficiencies and hurt the economy.
So I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. It's not just about new versus old.
No.
It's about carefully considering all these factors, productivity learning curves, substitution possibilities,
Right.
before making big policy decisions.
Exactly.
Okay, now before we go any further, can you remind me what the JY12 model assumed about the tax scheme?
Sure.
I remember reading something about that in the research you sent.
Yeah, so the model assumes a specific kind of tax scheme,
Okay.
one with no net transfers to or from the capital sector. Essentially, they wanted to isolate the impact of intervintage transfers.
So like how shifting resources between different vintages affects the economy.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're trying to see what happens when you move money around within the capital sector
Right.
without adding or subtracting any from the outside.
Exactly.
Makes sense, but what happens if we change that assumption?
That's a great question.
What if the tax scheme is designed to keep aggregate investment constant?
The researchers explored that scenario too.
Oh.
And instead of aiming for zero net transfers, they tried to maintain a steady level of overall investment.
Okay.
And you might be surprised to hear that the results are really similar. Even when investment is held, constant subsidizing new tech can still lead to a decline in welfare and GDP.
So it's not just about how much is being invested, but also about where that investment is going.
Exactly.
Distorting the vintage structure of capital, even without changing overall investment levels, can have a significant impact on the economy. Really underscores the potential risks of just blindly subsidizing new tech without considering the broader context.
Exactly.
You know how we love to poke and prod at assumptions here on the deep dive?
Yeah.
So which assumptions did they put under the microscope?
Okay, well, one of the key assumptions in the JY12 model is that new tech starts with zero productivity and then gradually improves as people learn to use it.
Right, like the learning curve.
Exactly, the learning curve.
But what if new tech isn't completely unproductive at the start?
Yeah.
What if there's some level of existing knowledge or skills that can be applied to it?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So to address that,
Okay.
the researchers modified the learning function in the model.
Okay.
Instead of assuming that learning starts from zero, they allowed for the possibility of a positive initial productivity level. And they called this parameters bar.
Okay, so SAR represents that baseline level of knowledge or skill that's already there.
Exactly.
When the new tech hits the scene. Kind of like a head start on the learning curve.
Exactly, head start.
And what did they find?
Well, they found that allowing for CESA bar greater than zero can actually increase the macroeconomic impact of vintage-specific transfers.
Interesting. So if people are already somewhat familiar with the new tech, the distortions caused by subsidies could be even greater.
That's right.
That's counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you think about it.
It does.
If new capital isn't as unproductive at the start,
Right.
the distortion in the capital distribution becomes more pronounced.
Exactly.
It's like giving a powerful tool to someone who already knows the basics. The potential for both good and bad outcomes is magnified.
Exactly.
This is all so fascinating.
It is.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
Right.
Every time we think we have a simple answer, another layer of complexity emerges.
That's economics for you. It's rarely straightforward.
Yeah.
But speaking of complexity, we also need to talk about the rate of technological progress, which the model represents with the parameter gamma.
Okay, gamma, remind me what that represents again. I remember seeing it in the graphs.
So gamma represents how quickly the productivity of new vintages improves over time.
Okay, so a higher gamma means faster technological progress.
Exactly.
Got it. What happens if we play around with that parameter?
Well, to test the importance of gamma, the researchers ran simulations with a very low value.
Okay.
And they found that the impact of taxation on long-run consumption decreased dramatically. This suggests that the rate of technological progress is really crucial in determining the effects of vintage-specific policies.
So if technological progress is slow,
Right.
those policies might not have as much of an impact, positive or negative.
Yeah, it's like pushing on a brick wall.
Yeah.
You might exert a lot of effort, but you're not going to see much movement.
Okay, good analogy.
Now, another crucial factor that we need to consider is the elasticity of substitution, or sigma.
Okay, sigma, we talked earlier about how different vintages aren't perfect substitutes.
Right.
But how substitutable they are can vary widely.
That's right.
Like, I could probably switch from a gas-powered car to an electric one without too much disruption to my life.
Right.
But trying to replace a surgeon with a robot, that's a whole different story.
Exactly. And sigma measures that degree of substitutability.
Okay.
A higher sigma means different vintages are more easily interchangeable.
Got it. So if sigma is really high, does vintage capital even matter?
Well,
if everything is basically interchangeable, wouldn't the age of the technology be irrelevant?
It's a tempting conclusion, but it's not that simple.
Okay.
As sigma increases, two things happen.
Okay.
First, the impact of those tax wedges, like subsidies or taxes on specific vintages, tends to fade because the differences between vintages matter less.
If everything's basically the same, who cares about vintage?
Right. But here's the catch. As sigma rises, those tax wedges can actually distort investment decisions even more severely.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
Imagine a scenario where a tiny price difference caused by a small subsidy leads to a massive shift in investment toward newer vintages.
Oh, wow.
This can create huge imbalances and inefficiencies.
So it's like a tipping point where a small push can trigger a landslide.
Exactly.
A tiny price difference shouldn't have such a dramatic effect.
Right.
So the relationship between sigma And the impact of vintage-specific policies is more complex than it might seem at first glance.
It is.
It sounds like the impact of those policies might be strongest at intermediate levels of sigma.
That's what the research suggests.
Where there's enough substitutability to cause distortions, but not enough to completely wash out the importance of vintage.
Exactly.
Wow, this deep dive is getting deeper by the minute.
I know, right?
It's clear that we need to consider all these factors, the learning curve, the rate of technological progress, the elasticity of substitution, to understand the true impact of vintage capital.
Absolutely.
Now, before we move on to discuss the dynamic aspects of this model, there's one more robustness check I want to highlight. The capital share, or alpha.
Right.
Refresh my memory on what that represents.
So alpha represents the portion of output that's attributed to capital as opposed to labor.
Okay.
It essentially measures how important capital is in the production process.
Right. And if I remember correctly, alpha also plays a role in determining how much impact those intervintage transfers have.
Exactly.
Okay.
The research found that when alpha is higher, the impact of those transfers is amplified. Which makes sense.
Yeah.
If capital is a larger contributor to output, then distortions in the capital structure will have a greater effect on the overall economy.
So in economies where capital plays a bigger role, those vintage-specific policies could have even more profound consequences.
Precisely.
This highlights the importance of understanding the specific context of an economy when designing and implementing these policies.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
This deep dive has been a real roller coaster ride.
It has.
We've explored the definition and significance of vintage capital, delved into those intriguing vintage-specific policies, and even challenged some of the model's assumptions.
We did.
But wait, there's more.
There is?
We still need to talk about transition dynamics.
Yes.
That is how the economy adjusts when those vintage-specific policies are implemented or removed.
Exactly.
It's like the difference between looking at a snapshot and watching a movie. We need to understand how those changes unfold over time to get the full picture.
And that's exactly what the researchers set out to do.
Okay.
They developed a way to simulate the model over time.
Okay.
To study those dynamics.
So they're basically running experiments to see how the economy reacts when those vintage-specific policies are put in place or taken away.
Exactly.
Tell me more.
Okay. Their first experiment involved starting from a steady state where new capital was heavily subsidized.
Okay.
Then they simulated what would happen if that subsidy was suddenly removed.
So imagine a world where those shiny new gadgets are getting all the love from the government, and then bam, the support vanishes overnight.
Right.
How does the economy cope?
Well, the model shows that there's a period of adjustment.
Okay.
But it happens surprisingly quickly. Output, which was initially depressed because of the subsidy, starts to recover.
Okay.
And both consumption and investment rise towards their new steady state levels.
So it's like the economy takes a deep breath, shakes off the effects of the subsidy, and starts heading in a new direction.
Exactly.
And how long does this all take?
Well, the remarkable thing is that this adjustment happens in a matter of years, not decades.
That's much faster than I would have expected.
It is.
And what does that mean for the bigger picture?
Well, it has important implications for how we think about those long-run welfare comparisons we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
If the transition is rapid, it means that those steady-state comparisons are actually pretty good indicators of the overall welfare effects of these policies.
So even though we're looking at a simplified model, it suggests that the real-world economy might be able to adapt to these policy changes pretty quickly.
That's the key takeaway.
To get a more precise picture of the welfare effects during the transition, the researchers calculated a measure called the compensating variation.
Right.
Now, compensating variation. It's basically asking how much extra consumption people would need each period during the transition to make them just as happy as they would be in the new steady state.
You got it.
It's a way to quantify the welfare costs or benefits of those temporary adjustments.
Exactly.
If the compensating variation is small, it means those adjustments aren't too painful. So what did they find? Was it large and scary?
Actually, they found that the compensating variation was really small.
Okay.
Less than 0.2% of steady-state consumption per period.
Wow, that's tiny.
It is.
So even though there are some short-term hiccups,
Yeah.
the overall welfare loss from removing the subsidy is relatively minor.
Exactly.
Now, they also ran a simulation starting from a steady state where new capital was actually taxed, not subsidized.
Right.
So this time we're imagining a world where the government is favoring older, more established technologies, and then boom, taxes lifted.
Then.
The economy, once again, adjusts pretty quickly, with output converging to its new steady state within a couple of years. But interestingly, in this scenario, consumption actually increases initially, while investment dips a bit.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Why would consumption go up when a tax is removed?
That's a good question.
Wouldn't we expect people to invest more?
You'd think so, but...
It's because that initial tax on new capital created a scarcity of newer, more productive capital.
Right.
When the tax is removed, it becomes more efficient to let that older capital depreciate and shift investments towards newer vintages.
Got it.
But since that new capital is initially relatively unproductive.
Right, because of the learning curve.
Consumption increases in the short run.
It's like suddenly having access to a delicious new food that you've been craving.
Yeah.
You might indulge a bit before you get back to your regular diet.
That's a great analogy.
So how does the compensating variation look in this scenario?
Well, just like in the previous simulation, the researchers calculated the compensating variation to measure the welfare effects of this transition. And once again, they found it to be very small.
How small?
Only about 0.02% of steady state consumption per period.
Wow. So whether we're talking about removing a subsidy or a tax, the transition costs associated with these policy changes seem to be pretty minor.
They do, at least according to the model.
So it seems like the economy is pretty resilient, able to bounce back from these shifts without too much disruption.
That's the key takeaway. And it suggests that policymakers might not need to be overly cautious about adjusting these policies.
Right.
Even if they involve significant changes in the way different vintages of capital are treated. But of course, this is just one model.
Sure.
And it's important to consider the specific context of each situation.
This has been an incredible journey through the world of vintage capital.
It has.
We've covered so much ground, from the theoretical foundations to the practical implications and even the nuances of transition dynamics.
Absolutely.
I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of how this all works now.
Me too.
But before we move on, I want to bring up one last point that was raised in the research. The study focuses specifically on the role of vintage capital. But it acknowledges that there might be other channels through which policy can impact the economy, especially in environments where technology is embodied in capital.
That's right.
So we need to remember that this is just one piece of the puzzle. The economy is a complex system.
It is.
And there are many factors that can influence growth and development.
Right.
The research mentions the potential role of human capital or the skills and knowledge of the workforce. And it suggests that the interaction between vintage physical capital and vintage human capital could magnify the effects of these policies.
That's a great point.
So imagine a scenario where policies not only support new technology, but also invest in training programs that help workers adapt to those technologies.
Exactly.
The combination of those two approaches could lead to even greater economic gains.
That's the idea.
It's like providing both the hardware and the software for success. Give people the tools and the skills to use them effectively, and you've got a recipe for real progress.
I agree.
Now, another area that deserves further exploration is the distinction between new and used capital within a given vintage.
Right.
The research we've been discussing doesn't really delve into that distinction.
It doesn't.
But it could be really relevant when we consider things like reallocation costs or the challenges faced by credit-constrained firms. It's one thing to buy a brand new piece of equipment. But it's another thing entirely to acquire used machinery. Or repurpose existing assets for new tasks.
Exactly.
Those decisions often involve additional costs and complexities that the model doesn't fully capture.
It doesn't.
And understanding those nuances could provide valuable insights for policymakers looking to support economic development.
It could.
Especially in countries where access to new capital might be limited.
Exactly.
So it's clear that the world of vintage capital is full of intriguing questions and challenges.
It is.
And while we've made some progress in understanding its role in the economy, there's still much more to explore.
Absolutely.
Well, we've certainly given our listeners plenty to think about.
I think so.
But before we wrap up this episode, I want to leave everyone with one last thought. The research we've been discussing today suggests that just simply subsidizing new technology might not be the best approach. But what if, instead of focusing on the technology itself, we shifted our attention to the people who use that technology.
That's an interesting idea.
What if we invested in education and training programs that help people develop the skills they need to not only operate, but also innovate and adapt to new technology?
That'd be great.
What if we created policies that foster collaboration and knowledge sharing between different generations of workers so that the wisdom and experience of those familiar with older technologies could be leveraged to accelerate the adoption of newer vintages?
That's a fascinating proposition.
It would require a shift in perspective.
It would.
But it could potentially unlock a whole new level of economic growth and prosperity.
Right. It could.
Instead of just chasing the latest shiny object, we need to empower people to become the drivers of technological progress.
Right.
Give them the skills and the knowledge to harness the power of new technology and watch the economy truly flourish.
I couldn't agree more.
It's about investing in human capital alongside physical capital.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into vintage capital.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore.
There is.
Join us in part 2, where we'll continue our journey into the fascinating world of vintage capital.
I'll be there. Welcome back to the deep dive. It's great to be continuing this exploration of vintage capital with you.
This is one of those topics that just keeps unfolding, like those Russian nesting dolls. You peel back one layer and find another waiting underneath.
Exactly. And those layers are all interconnected. Remember how we were just talking about human capital?
Yeah.
And the need to empower people alongside investing in new technologies?
Absolutely. It's like giving someone a shiny new sports car, but forgetting to teach them how to drive stick shift.
Right.
All that potential, but they can't go anywhere.
Precisely. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of vintage capital.
Okay.
The diffusion of new technology. Even with the right skills and knowledge, it takes time for new technologies to spread throughout the economy and reach their full potential.
So it's not like flipping a switch. New tech doesn't just magically transform the economy overnight.
It doesn't.
There's like a process of adoption and integration that needs to happen.
Exactly. And this diffusion process is often depicted graphically as an S-shaped curve.
Okay.
It starts slowly as early adopters experiment with the new technology, then accelerates as the benefits become more apparent and the learning curve flattens.
Yeah.
And eventually plateaus as the market becomes saturated.
I'm picturing that S-curve in my mind. It makes sense that it wouldn't be like a straight line.
Right.
But what factors influence like the shape of that curve?
Yeah, what makes some technologies spread like wildfire while others just fizzle out?
Exactly.
That's a great question. And the research you sent delves into some of those key determinants.
Okay.
One of the most important is the complexity of the technology itself.
Okay.
So technologies that are easy to understand and use tend to diffuse more quickly.
That makes sense. Think about something like the microwave oven.
Right.
Relatively simple to use.
Yeah.
And it revolutionized the way people cook.
Exactly. On the other hand, technologies that require specialized knowledge or training, like advanced robotics or artificial intelligence, tend to have a slower diffusion rate.
Makes sense because there's a steeper learning curve involved.
Exactly.
And remember we talked earlier about how that learning curve can be a drag on the economy?
Right.
If it's not properly addressed?
Precisely. Another important factor is the availability of complementary technologies and infrastructure. Think about electric vehicles.
Okay.
They might be amazing machines.
Yeah.
But their diffusion is limited by things like the availability of charging stations.
Right.
And a reliable power grid.
It's like having a state-of-the-art computer but no internet connection.
Exactly.
All that potential, but you can't access the information you need.
Exactly. And then there are social and cultural factors to consider. Some societies are more receptive to new technologies than others.
Yeah, this reminds me of that article you sent about how different countries approach things like automation.
Right.
Some embrace it wholeheartedly while others are more hesitant.
It's a complex interplay of economic, technological, and societal forces.
Okay, so we've got this S-shaped diffusion curve.
Yeah.
And its shape is influenced by things like complexity, complementary technologies, and cultural attitudes. But how does all of this tie back into the concept of vintage capital?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
The diffusion of new technology is really intimately connected to the age structure of capital.
Okay.
As newer, more productive technologies diffuse, they gradually replace older vintages. And this process of creative destruction, as economists call it, is what drives long-term economic growth.
So it's not just about the existence of new technology.
No.
It's about how quickly and effectively it spreads throughout the economy.
Exactly. And this is where those vintage-specific policies we discussed earlier come into play.
Yeah.
By targeting specific vintages.
Okay.
Policymakers can try to influence the pace and direction of technological diffusion.
So those policies are like levers that governments can use to try and steer the economy towards like a desired technological mix?
Exactly. They can promote the adoption of newer vintages through subsidies or tax breaks.
Yeah.
Or they can support older vintages through protectionist measures.
Right.
But, as we've seen, these interventions can have both intended and unintended consequences.
It's not as simple as just picking winners and losers.
It isn't.
There's like a whole ecosystem of interconnected factors to consider.
Yeah.
It's like trying to conduct an orchestra. You can't just focus on one instrument. You need to make sure all the parts are working together in harmony.
That's a great analogy. Now, speaking of harmony, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the concept of technological congruence.
Technological congruence? That sounds intriguing.
It refers to the idea that the different vintages of capital within an economy should be compatible with each other.
Okay.
In other words, the technologies embedded in machines, factories, infrastructure, and so on should work together smoothly.
So it's like making sure all the pieces of the puzzle fit together.
Exactly.
If you have one piece that's totally out of whack, it throws off the whole picture.
Exactly. And when there's a high degree of technological congruence, the economy tends to be more productive and efficient. Information flows more easily, processes are streamlined, and there's less friction in the system.
Gotcha. But what happens when there's a mismatch between different vintages?
Yeah.
What if the pieces of the puzzle don't quite fit?
So that's when you start to see bottlenecks, inefficiencies, and even economic stagnation. Imagine a factory with state-of-the-art machinery, but a woefully outdated IT system. The machines might be capable of producing at lightning speed. But the flow of information is hampered by that slow and clunky IT infrastructure.
It's like having a Ferrari engine in a horse-drawn carriage.
Right.
All that power, but you're still stuck in the slow lane.
Exactly. And this is why it's so important for policymakers to consider technological congruence. When designing economic policies. Simply promoting the adoption of the newest technology isn't enough. You need to ensure that those new technologies can integrate smoothly with the existing capital stock. And that the workforce has the skills to operate them effectively.
It's about creating an environment where innovation can thrive without disrupting the overall functioning of the economy.
Precisely. And this brings us to the concept of vintage human capital, which we touched upon earlier. Just as there are different vintages of physical capital, there are also different vintages of human capital, reflecting the skills and knowledge that workers possess.
So someone who learned to code on a Commodore 64 has a different vintage of human capital than someone who grew up with smartphones and cloud computing.
Exactly. And just like with physical capital, it's important to consider the age structure of human capital when thinking about economic growth and development. So a workforce with a high proportion of older, vintage human capital might struggle to adapt to rapidly changing technologies.
Which could lead to skills gaps, unemployment, and slower economic growth.
Exactly. This is why investing in education and training programs is so crucial. It's about helping workers upgrade their skills and stay ahead of the technological curve. It's about fostering lifelong learning and adaptability.
It's about empowering people to be active participants in the process of technological change. Rather than passive bystanders.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Now, before we wrap up part 2 of our deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Always love a good cliffhanger.
This deep dive has focused on the economic implications of vintage capital. But the concept has relevance beyond just dollars and cents.
Oh, do tell.
Think about it. We've talked about how different vintages of technology coexist and interact within the economy. But the same thing happens in society as a whole. We have different generations with different experiences, values, and ways of looking at the world.
So you're saying there's like a social dimension to vintage capital as well?
Exactly. We often talk about generational divides, but maybe we should be thinking about generational congruence. How can we create a society where different generations can learn from each other, share their knowledge and experiences, work together to build a better future.
It's about bridging the gap between those who grew up with rotary phones and those who've never known a world without the internet.
Right.
It's about recognizing that every generation has something valuable to contribute.
Precisely. And that's a conversation we can continue in part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay.
Join us then as we explore the social and cultural dimensions of vintage capital.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're wrapping up our exploration of vintage capital, and wow, this has been one of the most thought-provoking deep dives we've ever done.
Yeah, it's a topic that makes you think about the connections between technology, economics, and even society as a whole.
Totally. And you left us with a real cliffhanger at the end of part 2.
Oh, yeah.
You hinted that vintage capital has a social dimension that goes beyond just the economic impact.
Right. We've been focusing on how different vintages of technology impact things like productivity growth and policy decisions.
Right.
But those technologies don't exist in a vacuum.
Of course.
They're developed and used by people.
Right.
And those people are shaped by their own unique historical and cultural contexts.
So just like there are different vintages of capital, there are different vintages of people.
Exactly.
Each generation carrying its own set of experiences and values and ways of seeing the world.
Exactly. And those generational differences can sometimes lead to friction or misunderstanding.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to technology.
Oh, tell me about it. I'm constantly trying to explain TikTok to my parents, and they still think email is like the pinnacle of modern communication.
That's a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
You've got the digital native generation growing up immersed in technology.
Right.
And then you have older generations who've had to adapt and learn new ways of doing things as technology has evolved.
It's like speaking different languages sometimes.
Yeah.
But instead of French or Spanish, it's the language of smartphones versus the language of rotary phones.
Exactly. And this can create challenges not just in personal interactions, but also in the workplace and in society as a whole.
So how do we bridge this generational divide? How do we create a society where different vintages of people, so to speak, can coexist and thrive?
I think it starts with recognizing that every generation has something valuable to contribute. Older generations bring experience, wisdom, and a historical perspective.
Right.
That can be invaluable in navigating the complexities of a rapidly changing world.
They've seen it all, right?
They have.
They've lived through economic booms and busts, technological revolutions and societal shifts. They have a perspective that we as like a younger generation are just beginning to develop.
Exactly. And younger generations bring fresh ideas,
a
willingness to experiment, and a fluency in new technologies that can help drive innovation and progress.
So it's that classic combination of wisdom and enthusiasm, the yin and yang of generational dynamics.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And when those two forces come together, you have the potential for something truly special.
But how do we make that happen? How do we foster that kind of intergenerational collaboration and knowledge sharing?
I think it starts with communication. We need to create opportunities for different generations to interact, share their perspectives, and learn from each other.
So instead of just complaining about how kids these days are glued to their phones, maybe we should be asking them to teach us how to use those phones to connect with the world in new and meaningful ways.
Exactly. It's about breaking down those stereotypes and recognizing the strengths and values of each generation.
And it's about recognizing that technology itself can be a bridge between generations.
Absolutely.
Think about social media platforms that connect grandparents with their grandchildren, or online learning platforms that allow people of all ages to access educational resources.
Right. Technology can be a powerful tool for fostering intergenerational connection and understanding.
For sure, but it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how we use it. Right. It's about creating a culture of inclusivity. Where everyone feels valued and respected regardless of their age or technological prowess.
Exactly. It's about building a society where different vintages of people with all their unique experiences and perspectives can come together to shape a future that benefits everyone.
Wow, this has been such an incredible deep dive.
It has been.
We started by exploring the economics of vintage capital, but we ended up with a much broader understanding of how technology generations and society as a whole are all intertwined.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It is.
And it's a reminder that we can't just focus on the technical or economic aspects of these issues.
Right.
We need to consider the human element as well.
We need to remember that progress isn't just about adopting the latest technology. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and contribute. Regardless of their age or their vintage.
I agree.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. A huge thank you to you for guiding us through this complex and fascinating topic.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you've learned something new and that you'll continue to explore the world with curiosity and an open mind. Until next time, keep diving deep.